Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the BS and Beer Show. BS stands for Building Science. Tonight's topic is developers who do good. So my name's Ben Bogey. This evening, I'm drinking a Cool Ship Lager from OEC Brewing here in Connecticut. BS and Beer is an independent grassroots movement to share building science knowledge through local meetup groups and this, our Zoom show. The brew crew and our guests volunteer our time each week to bring you what we hope is a fun and informative discussion. Firstly, we'd like to thank Green Building Advisor and then Fine Home Building Magazine for being our media partners and helping us put this together on the back end every week. And with that, off to you, Emily.
Hi guys, Emily Mottram managed to grab a beer just in time for the show. I'm on announcements tonight. Today is Veterans Day, so we just want to announce that for the show today and give our thanks to all of our veterans out there. Thanks for joining us if you're on. Thanks for your time and your service. So happy Veterans Day to anybody who's joining us. If you're new to Zoom, which I don't know after this pandemic, how'd you be new to Zoom? But if you're new to Zoom, the chat box is probably lighting up on the bottom of your screen. Join us in the chat box. Everybody who's here, announce that you're here. Tell us what you're drinking or not drinking so that your friends know that you are here. Only the panelists can see the list of people who are here. So introduce yourself in the chat box. Please pick everyone or all panelists and all attendees. Different versions of Zoom have it different ways. Otherwise, only the panelists get to see your notes in the chat box. Fine Home Building sends out a Zoom reminder every week. That is simply just a reminder to show up to the show. If you want to know what we're going to talk about, pop over to the bsandbeershow.com and join our mailing list, and you'll get a weekly mailer that talks about what we're going to talk about and who our guests are that week for the show. There's a video recording for tonight's show and all of our previous shows on our YouTube channel, The BS and Beer Show, and you can get to it through Green Building Advisor's blog post on The BS and Beer Show as well. An audio-only version of the show is available if you'd like to listen to it. The best way is to join us live and join the chat box, then watch the videos on YouTube. But if you have to listen to it, there is audio only available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. A couple of announcements. The Brew Crew is going to be at the NAHB International Builders Show February 8th through the 10th. We're going to be doing some live shows. Come down, join us, tune in live for the shows that week while we're at the show. We'll put links in the chat box for those. We want to highlight Passive House Accelerator is another excellent resource for anyone interested in zero carbon building and passive house design and construction. So we'll put a link to Passive House Accelerator. Check out what they do. And also we wanted to mention the Pretty Good House graphic guide. So if you guys are super excited about the Pretty Good House book that's going to come out next year, and you need to get a little bit of Pretty Good House in right now, our friend Helen Watts, who may be in the chat box, has a graphic guide for Pretty Good House available on Etsy. So we'll post a link for that if you just need a little filler until the whole big book comes out. So with that, Mike, do you want to introduce our guests and yourself?
Yes. Thank you, Emily. I have the honor of introducing our guests tonight. First, I am drinking a Curious Elixirs number 3. It's a mocktail mixer, but I'm really living it up by drinking it straight. It's a really, really tasty mixer. Our guest tonight, Declan Keefe, is an entrepreneur in the realm of architecture, construction, and real estate development. He founded CoEverything to bring cooperative ownership to the real estate industry. He was also a founder and owner of the design, build, development cooperative Placetailor based in Boston. Declan, what are you drinking tonight, and anything to add to that short bio?
Tonight, I'm drinking actually a hot apple cider, and for the show specifically, I put in a cinnamon stick just to show how fancy it's going to be tonight. And it's from Apple a Day Orchard here in California, where I am right now.
Excellent. Our other guest tonight is Lois Arena. She's Director of Passive House Services at Stephen Winter Associates. She has the distinction of holding both U.S. and international Passive House consultant certifications and is currently consulting on some of the largest and most challenging Passive House projects in the world. Lois, what are you drinking tonight? And is there anything to add to that bio that we left out?
No, I think that bio is great. I am being boring and I have a blue moon, but I normally drink vodka. So to spice it up, you'll probably be getting a lot of belching from me, which I normally drink.
that just adds to the atmosphere here. Perfect. So yeah, we can just jump right into conversation. So I guess one question: we all know what development means, or do we know what development means? When we say development, what does that mean to you, or what should it mean to us? Declan, do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I can go. I think that development, typically in the context, I think, of what we're talking about here, real estate development, is the process of taking a project from original idea to acquisition of land, through the process with designers and architects, through planning and permitting, through financing, and ultimately managing through construction, and then either selling or getting tenants. And that whole process together, obviously oversimplified, is what a developer would do. And so development is the process of doing all of those things and managing that process from the early phase of the idea through execution and occupancy of a unit, whether that's commercial or residential. So that would be my quick overview of the things that go into real estate development.
Okay, so scale isn't an issue. Could you develop like a doghouse? Would it be an entire city? Is there like a typical scale we're talking about?
So I would say that there isn't a typical scale, and for instance, we're developing another cooperative that we've founded here in California, which is called OB Cooperative, stands for Our Backyard. We're developing backyard homes. So we're doing 650 square foot unit. So that's like the smallest scale that I've done in terms of actually being real estate development. We're doing land leases of backyards from a homeowner. So we're not even actually purchasing property. We're doing long-term land leases, which is typically a commercial thing, but we're doing it for a backyard home and then putting a long-term affordable housing unit in the backyard. So like that's one end. And then for me, the other end of the spectrum in terms of housing development is like 25, 26 unit multifamily development. So like that's the spectrum that I've covered in my career in active projects of mine. But it can scale from anything that you can imagine is a building. So, and I know that Lois is working on some of those bigger, more complicated things too. So I'll hand it over to her if she wants to chime in.
Yeah. What do you work on, Lois? I know it said some of the biggest and most challenging, but like, what do you, or what's most of your experience been, and what are you working on now?
So when I first started at Stephen Winter and we first started doing Passive House, I was a low-rise residential scale person, and our first really significant Passive House project turned out to be a 280,000 square foot, 26-story student housing, but basically was market rate housing for students, grad students. And before I started this, development to me meant clear cutting, right? Like I was a forestry major undergrad, and I was like, development was as a four-letter word. Like you just didn't say development around a forestry major. And then when I got into this, it's all about infill and affordable housing and the best use of resources that you can possibly do, and overall carbon and embodied carbon of a project. So it's completely changed my perspective of development. Development is creating, especially where housing is concerned, a space for people to live and grow. And the developers I get to work with are amazing, like completely opposite of the evil developer that you might think of, when you think about that clear cutting sort of a thing. They're people who care so much about their own communities. They're trying to develop housing for low income housing people in their own communities to elevate those populations. And so for the last 10 years, even the market rate builders that we work with have that same passion. And so it's it's one of those things that makes you change and be like, wow, I was really judgmental. Like it was like, wow, I didn't know what I was talking about at all. So that's what development to me is, creating place and space for people to grow and learn.
One of the things that I found really fascinating is I saw a presentation that you gave, Lois, at the FIAS conference a handful of weeks ago. And Passive House is gaining a lot of traction with developers right now in larger projects because of the fact that it scales really well. Yeah. And that a lot of these large projects are being brought in at about a 1.5% cost premium over traditional building. But then because a lot of this stuff is affordable housing, it's coming in and saving them money in the long term because they're having lower carrying costs for the project. So it's actually making smart business sense for a lot of developers. So they get to do good while being good for their investors at the same time.
Exactly. And they take that money and they reinvest it into more housing stock to create more affordable. There's some really drastic statistics about, there's like 100 people for every 30 available, 100 families for every 30 available affordable housing units in the United States. So like it's that in need. So the fact that they can roll their savings into more and more housing for these people is fantastic. It's a great vehicle.
Places like New York City, where the wait list for affordable housing is measured in decades, not just years.
Yeah.
Declan, I noticed you shook your head a little when Lois said 1.5% upcharge. Does that not match your experience, or was that an involuntary tick?
No, the head shake was 1.5% in the scale of a development project is negligible. 1.5% is left, like, not even using up an entire contingency. It's not even, it's the difference of one type of trim or another. It's so insignificant that when we even use that number, we might as well be saying 0, right? It's just about a matter of saying, we're making one decision on this development project or another. To label it 1.5%, it seems hard for me to justify that it's just that number. And I'm there's lots of analysis, and I've seen that number range anywhere from 0 to 15% on different projects of scale. So yes, there's some added costs in some places, but when we're talking about such a small number on such a big building, it's like becomes a no-brainer with the amount of energy savings. That's the point.
That's the key, Declan. It's the size of the projects that we work on. Like a single family home to get to Passive House, it's not 1.5%, right? It's much bigger percentage of your base project cost. As you get up in size for these buildings, the envelope becomes less and less important because you have more internal gains that offset the heating demand. So you actually come closer in line with code levels of energy performance. It's a little bit better, but code levels of insulation. When you're down in the single family range, you're putting in 2-3 times the amount of insulation as code. So the percentage is completely different. So I just want to let the audience know, I'm aware of that. I know for a 1,200 square foot home, it's not 1.5% to get to Passive House.
Yeah. So, but I even think of that, just to put my smaller scale perspective on it, is it might not be 1.5%, but it just needs to be categorized with all of the other decisions that go into making a building. It's like, how come this is the one thing that we pull out as a caveat and calculate the cost of? I've never heard what's the increase in cost for tile, right? Who says what's the 1% increase for a fancier tile? No one does that on a project. Or upgrading to a metal roof, what's the percentage increase for this roof versus that? That's not how we do the analysis, but it's all the same thing. It's a material within a building that makes it better or makes it worse. And so to pull that single piece out and look at it, to me, I think it's like, it's not even really looking at the whole process as a design process or a development process. Because us as developers, typically there's not a separate line that just says all Passive House stuff. No, we're financing the project as a whole project, and the banker wants to know that the whole project works, which is why I know some people around the country, when they're doing Passive Houses, don't tell anyone they're doing it, right? This is one of the strategies around high performance buildings, is they get more scared when you say it's something different, so they don't ever say it, and then they build a Passive House, and the banker's fine with it once they can sneak it by. So it's just my extra note about the way we think about it.
Yeah, that's the stealth passive approach. Yeah.
Well, and I worked not in development, but in doing energy audits for multifamily low income housing too, right? And they have to pay for that all on the back end of everything that they're doing. So like we did energy upgrades to their existing buildings to save them money to pay for improvement projects to keep their housing. So I saw somebody in the chat box said let people turn it over really quickly. Well, I don't think in low income housing they do get turned over really quickly. They are long-term. And so I think that's important to say on the screen, not just in the chat boxes. Can you guys talk a little bit about that is, on these larger projects, especially low income, maybe not low income, maybe market rate, maybe whatever is, is there a point at which, certain things like you have to hold on to it for 5 years or you have to, and is anybody even looking at that? I know in the low income developments, they are looking at that because a lot of it goes into, the length of time and the energy costs and what it costs you to physically live there. But you talk a little bit about that? Either one of you?
Yeah, I can take a shot at it. And I think I understood the question. And from the perspective of affordable housing, so that whole category, that's financed with some sort of government-based capital, they have to look at it long-term because the way that the financing works is it's delivered over time. So a tax credit for most of our LIHTC-based projects, which is low-income housing tax credits, are actually released to the project over 10 years. So usually there's actually an investor that comes in at the beginning of the project so they can utilize all that cash up front, but the project's actually getting it over 10 years. And so the project can't just be sold off. In fact, they're usually writing a requirement that they'll maintain and document for 15 years and that the project stays affordable and owned within the initial regulations, which if you're saying energy performance, you have to maintain that for 30 years. So within affordable housing, there's sort of a series of things that lock you in. 10 is when the financing, 15 is your documentation and paperwork, and 30 years is what you're promising. They just might not look at the paperwork for all of those years. And if you're agreeing to it for all of that time, essentially you have to maintain what you've said the project would be over that whole period of time. So affordable housing, high performance housing means that they're saying they'll maintain it, with a high performance economics, if that's built into their equations, which some states are actually giving credit through their affordable housing process to passive house or other high performance building standards, meaning that if you submit to a project and it's a competitive process against someone else who doesn't submit it as a passive house, say, you might get more points than them because you're saying it's a higher performing building, which means it's more likely you're selected, which means it's more likely you get financing. So it's in a pretty good number of states around the country, this is the case, with some great advocacy work of people that are probably here on the call.
So if there are reasonably good financial incentives and it's not hard to do high performance, if you're already building these, like why is this, or is high performance development a niche? If so, why does development have a bad rap? Why aren't more developers doing this?
Well, it's normal day practice for us, but it's not normal day practice out there. If you go to a conference outside of the passive house community and you say passive house, nobody knows what you're talking about. If I go to the NAHB conference and try to give a passive house presentation, I'm doing passive house 101, right? So that's what we're trying to do now, is get outside of our passive house community, go to other conferences like the P3 conferences and things like that, hotel conferences, like get out to people who've never heard of us before. It's always seen as a risk for the first time anybody does anything. They don't know it. They don't know what the costs are. They hear all these rumors because there's some bad rumors flying around. Like I had one bad rumor come out of New York that it cost 50% more to do passive house. And that went through the housing authority. And it took me 2 years to show them, no, that's not the case. Case on case on case of developers doing it over and over for 3%, you know? And I'm like, I don't know who your passive house consultant was on that project, but they screwed somebody over. Like, you know, like nobody knew what they were doing on that project. So that really hurt us. So any little rumor like that really puts a damp in the field. And anytime a developer or builder is going to do something, they have such tight margins that anytime they're going to do something that's going to touch those margins, all their subs have tight margins, you know, so like everybody's fearful of this. Once you get past the first one, it's good. So we're now getting to the point where we have years of utility data that we can share to prove the concept, to prove the costs, that I think it's going to start to get a little bit smoother out there. We've got our repeat builders that are doing 3, 4, 5 passive house developments. And we're in areas that are looking at fines for carbon pretty soon, right? If you're not meeting a certain carbon level, the maximum level in your buildings, you're going to start to see fines. So the incentive, there's financial incentives to do better, but there's also going to be financial incentives, penalties to do better. So it's really ramping up the research and education in those areas.
I think along those lines too, is you've talked about bigger buildings and infill buildings, and you're working in locations that are pushing for that are going to start to have fines. But there's a large part of the country that has rural, suburban, sprawl developments that are just single family homes, a whole bunch of them in a row, you know, where those developers aren't holding on to them. They're more into land management. They make the money on the land. They build whatever they can put on it to sell it. Like, do either of you do any of that type of development? And how do we get those developments to do better, right? Like, how do we get, I don't know, homeowner buy-in to change the perspective for those developers? Because, you know, in more rural areas, they're not building 26 stories. I mean, I think the tallest building in Portland is like 19 stories, I think. Like, you know, up here in Maine, we don't have a whole lot of really big building. Now they're doing infill and, you know, that's getting better, but like what happens in slightly outside of, you know, metropolitan areas? Do either of you deal with that at all?
Yeah, we do to some degree. I wouldn't say that maybe the examples you're giving are more about larger tract home developments, and I can't say I've done that. But I think that the same sort of rules apply, is that the market for a real estate developer is all about managing risk, right? So for them, doing anything that changes the norm inserts risk back into the equation, right? If they've done the same thing over and over and over and over, there's less risk for them because they know exactly what it's going to cost. Even when you can present them with something that says someone might actually pay a premium for this, which is you may have the potential to make more money if you made a higher performing house or built something more quality. It's only a specific type of developer who's willing to take the risk to get that potential higher return when they have what they feel like is a pretty guaranteed return that maybe is even lower. So this is sort of what we're up against. Is, you know, one of the framing questions around this conversation today was, you know, is it all about money? Well, to some degree it is, but that doesn't mean that having it all be about money doesn't mean that going high performance isn't actually a better economic perspective too. And there's actually, you know, when you compare the studies of how much housing is being built to be high performance compared to how many people who would be interested in it, there's actually far more people interested in, who believe in climate change, who would want to make a difference, who would rather live in a house like that than the amount of housing that's being built that way. And I think, and if you actually also look at the market studies of people are willing to pay more for that too. So there just has to be sort of the matching of the market proving itself that they would actually pay for it, that they would show up and buy that house for, you know, maybe not that much more, 3-5% extra, which probably can get down to, you know, 2-3% extra when you're building tract homes, because you can do so many and replicate over and over and get the costs down. So I think that's some of it is each industry or each part of the development sector has to take the leaps. So like larger buildings, it's starting to happen, right? People are seeing that those costs are really small to upgrade, and the impact is long-term and beneficial economically and for the environment. And they also see that there's going to be carbon fees coming down the line. So they're taking action now. That's not really on the horizon yet for smaller houses. And so those developers aren't feeling the squeeze to do it yet in most places. And they're not seeing the market present itself because there's not enough examples yet. So someone's just got to take the leap and build a high performance, sprawl development. I guess, if that's what we want to recommend here. I don't know, but
yeah, I was not recommending that. I was just saying that I've been. My husband and I lived in Rochester, New York for a couple of years, and it was amazing to me. I didn't think there was a single family architect in Rochester. Like I tried to look like, where are my single family architects or whatever, but there's a ton of tract housing, like just over and over and over again. And I thought, man, okay, people are doing this. If they're going to do it, could we do it better? Like, should we make it so we can't do it anymore? I mean, because it certainly doesn't help with affordable housing, because if you still have to have a car to drive everywhere, right, that doesn't work for everybody. And so, but that a lot of our country is a little bit more rural, and maybe that's more common. So
I think part of this equation, in order to see this kind of hit even more broader acceptance, is also on the banking end, because we have to see the mortgage companies more so accept the fact that it's actually a lower risk investment for them to carry a note on a high performance property than it is for a traditional code built property. And it's actually timely that we're discussing this, because I just got an email today from a real estate and mortgage group in our area that's trying to set up a local kind of knowledge share of the industry to discuss that and how we can start to help the mortgage guys understand what the investment benefits are, as well as discuss how we can get clients and the buyers to understand what the benefits are for making these choices. So I think it's not just financial on the developer's end, it has to be financial on the bank's end to help carry this. I think we're getting there. I think it's moving. So
I don't know. I've had those conversations 30 years ago when I was living in Colorado. Where they're just doing tract house. I mean, at the time it was just a constructive boom. I think it still is. And tract housing is their specialty out there. There was one developer in particular who really just embraced green building. And it was Energy Star at the time, was sort of cutting edge, but like he took just all the benefits and sold the benefits, comfort, quiet, and he gave them a checklist. Anybody that came in to look at his house, he gave them a checklist to go ask any other builder that they go to see, do you do this? Do you do this? Do you do this? He also had a cross section of his wall out in any one of his model homes. He was just a genius at selling the benefits of energy efficient, comfortable housing. And that's what our market rate passive house builders do. They don't sell passive house. They sell quiet. They sell healthy. That's what they sell. And so environmental equity, they sell all of the perks of it. Selling the product doesn't really work. You got to sell the perks. And so for tract housing, it's like in you guys know Thomas O'Leary from Passive House Academy in Ireland. Okay, so he's a hot ticket. Well, he actually worked with the government there in the whole country and got this NZEB program approved, and it's basically their code. And so you can't build a house without having a blower door done before TCO. You can't build a house without having the ventilation system commissioned before you get TCO. And he helped develop this program. So it's a nearly zero energy building, not net zero, but it was brilliant the way they did it and just sort of stepped up their code. And it's a national thing now. I would highly recommend you bring him on here to talk about, because Ireland's all, single family homes and tract housing and things like that. It's not large scale buildings, but we were on a call with him with the Passive House Accelerator folks last week just to talk about how do we bring that here? And it would be a really good conversation for this group, I think. It would be really interesting because we're still trying to figure that out. This is exactly the market sector we should talk about with this program.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Tomas was actually my passive house trainer, so I
Mine too.
used to. Yeah, no, we should absolutely.
Absolutely. It was brilliant.
Um, what about, so I mean it's great that there's financial incentives to do, to reduce the operating carbon emissions. You mentioned, sort of the carbon tax aspect, that I assume that's more for embodied carbon, or is that for carbon for operating emissions as well?
Operating.
Okay. So is, I know this is a criticism of passive house in general, but what I'm trying to say, what about embodied carbon? Just is that anything worth considering? Is that a big benefit of bigger developments? Is there a sweet spot? Like once you're over 10 stories, does the embodied carbon go up again?
Declan, I don't know if you are familiar with this as far as small versus big. I do know it's part of the conversation for all of our projects now. And I think both passive house organizations are looking at embodied carbon tools. I know PHI is developing what's called the pH ribbon, which is a plug-in tool to the PHPP, so that you can do some embodied carbon. And we're doing a beta test on it right now to see how good it is. There's so many little tools out there that nothing's really perfect right now. Yeah. It's a big area, right? But yes, it's a part of the conversation, but it hasn't been inserted into the certification yet.
Yeah, I know for us, I think it's all sort of bespoke, the way in which we each are doing our embodied carbon calculations and analysis, and we're still sort of in that same boat on the smaller scale things. But jumping back a little bit and then connecting some dots, in California, it's building code. All new buildings have to be net zero, so we're doing it in California. It's here. And it's kind of funny because it's a recent code that's just happened, and I'm out here now, and a lot of builders don't know that it's the case, and don't necessarily know what that means in terms of how is it going to change what they do. And so there'll be a learning curve that's forced upon people here. But then to connect it to the carbon, like for us, what it means when the code now says zero net energy, which it's not the best method that they're using to get there with their tools, but it is part of the code, is that the low embodied carbon is the frontier, right? Once the code reaches to operating energy has to be zero, then you take the next step to get your embodied energy down to zero, which is what we're doing on our projects in California. And we look at it and calculate it everywhere, but we're specifically looking at carbon zero buildings, sort of covering the whole lifespan of the project. So I think it's something that we have on our projects here, the ability to look at, because they're pretty small scale, but it also we're trying to develop systems that, for us, we're working on a prefabrication system so that it could scale it, up larger too. And I think that's partly what's happening in terms of high performance and really buildings at any scale, but largely in this smaller single family. There's a lot of people working on high performance, some form of prefab or modular, that have really great products that could make it easier to go to market and spread faster than maybe we've seen before. So that makes me feel a little bit hopeful. And then connecting one more dot back to one of the comments that you had, Ben, about the financing. I just wanted to say, sort of like, because I think a lot of people don't realize this, it's not just that bankers don't know or don't care. That might be the case, but there's actually federal regulations that regulate how they lend to projects. Right? They can't just do it, right? Even if they know and do care as an individual or an individual bank, it's federally regulated what they can look at and how they can finance a project based on which things cost what, based on regular market development projects. And the same is true for realtors when they're doing their estimating of projects or appraising of a project. They can't just give it value because they want to. They have to follow a process for how things are getting appraised. And so and that's regulated nationally too. It's not from the federal government, but it is still a national based process. And so when we have both of those things sort of tied together, it's hard to make those things move and change, because you can't just convince one bank to care. You might be able to let them look away a little bit, which is what's been starting to happen with some lenders, or look in certain places, but it is difficult because we have to make the big changes, at which point it could really open up lending in a whole new way for us as developers.
There's a comment in the chat box right now about the green and energy efficient addendum produced by the Appraisal Institute of Mortgage and Real Estate Appraisers, which you can push for your appraiser to, enact, and that could work in your favor. But to that effect, if we're not getting together and networking and trying to push this discussion at the small scale, even if we're hamstrung by policy, then it's never going to move forward. And kind of in the vein of what you were talking about, Declan, about everybody thinking about panelization and stuff, we have companies like Blueprint Robotics that are, creating panelized high performance wall assemblies that, originally they were doing single family luxury stuff. And I called them recently about a single family project, and they said, nope, sorry, all we're doing is multifamily. Don't even want to talk to you about residential. So it's happening. They started and they got their start by doing, luxury residential projects. And here we are. Now they don't even want to talk to us, which is great. I'm bummed because I'd like to use them, but it's great.
Chris, there's a few that do passive house level. Chris Corson does them up in Maine, and
New Energy Works outside of Albany.
Yeah. There's a few. They're coming. NYSERDA's trying to incentivize panelized manufacturers because they want to use them on all of these existing buildings, right, to make them net zero. So the energy sprung thing. So they're really trying to entice manufacturers to step up. Yeah.
I feel like we're at a tipping point, but that's probably famous last words.
I'd like to think so too. It's interesting. I'm friends with a Tiny Homes of Maine person who actually her background is in zero waste facilities for Toyota manufacturing cars. And so she had this whole idea of small micro factories that there would just be more of to kind of handle these solutions. And we're lucky maybe here up in Maine because we've got Unity, EcoCore, Go Home. We have a couple of options, to us, but that's not really widespread, Bright Built, not really widespread kind of across, but there are lots of modular companies who could maybe expand to that in the single family residential. I love that Blueprint Robotics is going on. I saw an Energy Sprung presentation. I thought that was amazing. We don't have those kinds of buildings everywhere, but we have them in some places. And so, skins and whatever. I'm very pro panelization. It always amazes me why we still stick build things, but yet at the same time we go and we look at it and it's still cheaper to stick build, so we stick build, right? And so and like you said about policy, right, until the bigger real estate market gets on board with valuing it from another, the addendum, we use that for our single family residential. That's great. But I've been a HERS rater for 10 years and it's in the MLS, but you can't put it in there. Right. And,
right.
The same, what I learned is, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who run a lot of the residential valuation, are apparently more concerned at the resale value if someone does default on a project than they are with you being able to stay there, which is that big federal policy, right? So you'd think it would be more cost effective for them to just be able to stay, right? But I don't know. And our codes are getting better in Portland and South Portland, Maine. They went from 2009 to 2021. It's a big culture shock for a bunch of people who had to jump from something that was, a big. And so we're doing a project in Portland, which was, super high performance based on 2009 that now just kind of meets code, which is great in my perspective. I love that. And so, as we get better, but it is a little bit hard when we don't step up and kind of continue to just follow along. So it's a slight increment every time we get better. It's a lot harder when the whole country says, nope, you know what? We're going to change this thing. And we're going to go from 0 to 100. So or I guess 100 to 0 is probably more accurate.
Right.
So,
Well, we've been mostly talking about sort of environmentally related stuff, and the only people stuff we've talked about are sort of how do we trick people into buying high performance, which is always a topic. What about is the type of development you both are involved in, is it good for neighborhoods, like established neighborhoods? Is it good for underserved populations? Is it good for the occupants, or is it really, are we really worried more about the environment at large and the developers' profit margins?
Declan,
Yeah, well, the center of my work within CoEverything is to essentially shift the way we think about a developer. And so usually it's an individual or a company that's developing a project, and all of the profits will be distributed, within to their investors or to their development team. And what we're working on is models where we can democratize the ownership of real estate. So individuals within the actual neighborhood can invest or co-develop, or in the very least be part of a more engaged community design process about what should actually be there in their community. And when you're doing those kind of processes, it's almost always the case they'd prefer to have a high performance building. And so, as if you're actually engaging with your community, those don't have to be in conflict with one another. Having the community be an owner or be involved as an investor or co-developer of some sort. And so for us, we're not just trying to build buildings that might have some sort of a tangential impact. We're trying to shift the way we do it to actually directly have an impact on the people who are there and of a place. And so we're focused a lot on crowdfunding or cooperative ownership of real estate. And these are, there's really very few people around the country working on these kinds of models. But we started CoEverything to test some of these things. So my transition from the last company, Placetailor, that was really in a similar way using real estate development to test how we can build high performance buildings as developers. And they've continued to do that work, and it's great. But I split off to start CoEverything to essentially use a similar model. How can we use real estate development as a way to have economic benefits for the community itself? And we could still do high performance buildings, but what else can we utilize the privilege and power and money that goes into real estate to do good within and for and with the community itself? So that's very much central to my work. So thanks for lifting up that platform.
I have so many questions. And along with that, and this was in the chat. I don't know if it was in the chat box or if Mike just put it in here, but community shared systems as well too. Like, do you do community solar and community ground source heat pumps, or like community access to systems beyond, just the house or the building, the co-housing shared? I mean, whether it's in a big building or individual buildings on a lot, that's a really interesting topic. Is it, you say good for the community, but also is there community shared, other larger infrastructure things?
Yeah, so our company works on different kinds of projects, not just buildings necessarily. So we're helping Co-op Power Boston to launch community solar campaigns. So they've been around in some form, but we're sort of helping put some steam behind it to get some solar put on a local affordable housing project that we can then sell credits to our community, which is really cool. Because another project of ours is a locally owned food co-op that's actually going in that same building. So there's like a really great synergy of cooperative ownership of the solar on the roof. It's an affordable housing development, and then a food co-op on the ground floor. Also, we're working on a project where there's community land trust for urban farmers, and so there creates access to people to actually grow food that they can then sell within their communities through CSAs and different sort of community-owned agriculture models. So for us, like the backbone to the way we look at our work at CoEverything is thinking about what are the things we need to live our lives, and that's usually shelter, which is in my career of building houses, it's food, it's energy, and it's community. And how can we take back control of those things locally as individuals and communities and neighborhoods from what are usually large multinational companies who provide our food, often develop our housing, who bring us our energy, and we have no say in any of the things that we need to live our lives. And so to shift all of that over and say, how can we democratize those things that we rely on again in our lives? And so, yeah, that's the backbone of our work. And so, yes, we do touch on other pieces of infrastructure, not always within one project. A lot of the way we do it is sort of different projects that all can relate, and we try to do them sort of within neighborhoods so that they can have relationships to one another, but not necessarily like I build a building and that building has a farm and that building has solar, and like it's not always happening in one project.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. We went from not doing anything in solar in Maine to going completely the opposite direction and having a whole bunch of, cooperative solar projects, which is awesome. So.
Great.
Yeah. And Lois, with Stephen Winter Associates, like as a company, I know the company sort of offers a broad range of services. Are you pretty much focused on this larger? Is it multifamily on the passive house end, and then sort of what other services does Stephen Winter provide that might support people wanting to do this kind of work?
So we're a consulting firm that does everything from single family to industrial, new and existing buildings. We do all the consulting, anything that touches the building, accessibility, universal design, all of the sustainability certification programs, commissioning, all the field testing. So from design conception through turning the building over, and then even beyond with O&M training and monitoring and customer service. So we're basically a whole suite of services. We've got 4 offices in the Northeast, and we are focused on whatever you can do to make a building operate better and give the occupants a better experience, living experience or operating experience. We're doing passive house on large scale commercial office space, mixed use residential, market rates and affordable. We've got schools, we've got university dormitories. So anything that you can either heat or cool and put a ventilation system on, you can apply to passive house. So.
So where do we go next? What's the next frontier that's burning at both of you for where you really want to push things?
I feel like I've been working at the next frontier for 10 years. It's like, okay, what's the next building type? What's this? And, what's the next big developer that we can touch? Who's the next big person that we can get the word out to? I can tell you, it's like being a research engineer in my group. You never stop learning. You never stop saying, I'm sure we can apply the standard to that program. Let's talk to one of the institutes and let's work on it. So we're constantly growing and pushing the field. How do we make it mainstream? I don't know. I keep asking myself. I've been asking myself that for a couple of years. Has everyone seen that stinking Well commercial? Not that I hate Well. They got DiCaprio, they got De Niro, they've got all of these A-list actors on the show. How do we get that? How did they get that?
Money.
Money.
How did they get that?
That's yeah.
Well, and I think what you're doing is really interesting because you touch all types of building. So I think in your particular one, because there are so many things in commercial building that we don't do in real estate as much, I think it's great because you do such a variety of projects that you're so used to some things that are just natural and commercial that you're like, no, we're going to apply this to the next project. And what I loved about what you said earlier was you're trying to go to different places and debunk the myths. That's really probably the biggest thing, right? Is like, let's go out there and let's start talking about that. Declan said there are more people who want better, housing and are willing to pay for it than there are developers who are willing to build it. So it's like and I see that too. We do obviously way smaller projects. I mean, I used to do lots more with multifamily residential. I don't do that as much anymore. But in our little neighborhoods, right? We have people wander in our neighborhood all the time. They're like, this is exactly what we wanted. But, we had to buy a tract house down the street because, we're small people who care about it. So we built that way. And, the developer up the street was working on different parameters, and so they were like, we want this. When are you going to do a next one? I'm like, well, we're self-funded. Like this, the next one's just, and for me, development feels like until you find the person with the money, right? The DiCaprios and the whatever, who's willing to fund that project to prove that it can be done, that it's worthwhile, that people want this, that makes sense, that pushes this envelope is, the same with, what they did overseas for changing their market. It's like, man, until that happens, it's just a slog every day.
And to back up what Declan said about people wanting this stuff, that local law 97 law in New York City, that means that in a certain number of years, people are going to start to pay fines if they don't bring their carbon production down, right? All the utility bills are being evaluated. If you're above a certain level, you're going to start to get fined. That was driven by social equity groups. It was not driven by me, any consultant. It was people who live in these communities where their pollution is the worst, where the homelessness is the worst, where their energy bills are the highest. These groups came out and said, this is what we need you to do for us. And it was pretty impactful.
Yeah, and for our work, that's who we're working with most now. It's sort of shifted in my career to most of our clients are activists. And what we're trying to do is to start from the activist side of the equation to organize around shifting the way we think about how developers are bad to we can be the developers and then we can do what we want, right? And what we want is community ownership. We want low embodied carbon. We want high performing buildings. And that is what they want, but they don't have the understanding yet as a sort of a network of people, as activists, to know that they have the power to be the one who actually does the development work. And this is the frontier we're working on, is local education for activists to understand it isn't a special thing to be a developer. It historically means you're a wealthy white man. That's often what it means, but it doesn't have to be that way. And as a wealthy white man, I can help show some ropes to the intricacies and the inequalities that are built into the mechanism, so that we can find our ways around them, utilizing those people who do care along the way. And I think because there's been such great organizing that's resulted in some of these campaigns like you're talking about, Lois, we really do have some untouched energy around real estate. That is why we're starting from this other end of the spectrum that we've not really done development from before, to see if we could sort of light the fire there to then make a change coming from our communities, as opposed to trying to come at it from the other end with lots of money and which we're going to need at some point. But the organizing that's resulted in a lot of these policies is done with not a lot of money. It's done with people power.
And Declan, I don't know if you guys have the same thing, but a lot of our affordable projects require minority or women-owned business to be a certain percentage of the workforce. So you're pulling from your community, you're elevating the minorities who don't have that experience, and they're getting that experience, so it's a really good mechanism.
Yeah, I think you could totally write a whole program on like demystifying the development part of it, because I think that's the biggest part about it. Is like you said, it doesn't have to be, just this one single person who's got all this funding to do it, right? You're especially with your cooperative, whether it's in the city, it's a big building, people want to live in an apartment, you need 50 people who are going to live in it, or a smaller network or neighborhood. Like, I think the scariest part is there's so much information to know and to weed through. Like, development is almost not about the housing part of it, and so much more about all of the other parts you have to put together to make it happen, right? And so it's overwhelming, so people don't do it, right? So if there's a model that you could kind of follow that's successful in how you do that, I mean, I think that's brilliant, and for large or smaller scales, for developers who are building large, low income passive house buildings, or for small cooperative groups who are, a certain number of people. And obviously it's going to be different everywhere, right? My favorite statement is to say, it depends. It's going to depend on where you are in the country. It's going to depend on what your resource has access to. It's going to depend on what the people in the community want. You might have a whole group of people who want 500 square feet. Or I mean, and I always think that's funny. Is like, the single family home market is like 2,500 square feet. That's the national average. And yeah, in New York City, there are people who live in like a closet, and they are perfectly happy with that because they have access to other things, so it's, I mean, it's depends on what you're close to. It is perception. Yeah. Or, I think the biggest success of development is it being in the right location, right? Is that when developments go bad, is when they're just not in the right spot? Like, you can have really small apartments in New York City because it's New York City. You have access to everything else.
Part of why development has a bad name is because what people think of is developers coming in and shoehorning or forcing something into an area that it doesn't work for the community and it doesn't work for the people involved, just in the means of making profit. So that's why, it's not something we've really touched on. We're talking about developers who do good. We haven't really talked about why developers have a bad name. And it's generally that, the light that people see them under is that they're just coming in to strip resources out of an area. So,
yeah.
Right, Lois.
Or just as a case study, and you might think that this is the real reason we asked you here tonight. Near me is a Colby College, and a former client of mine is high up. They're like the number 2 person, and they basically taken this sad, dejected mill town, Waterville, and made it, and they are working on making it into sort of the quintessential college town. And of course, because small liberal arts colleges are basically big businesses at this point, and they want to and have to sell sort of the environmental aspect, and they're having a real hard. They have a real shortage of housing for students and for visiting professors. So I've done a lot of building. I design houses now. I've never done development. How would somebody like me, like what would be a first step to convince Colby College to build a passive house or living building challenge dorm or multifamily or something like that? Who would you talk to, or who would I need to partner with, or should I just say, forget it?
So where Mike's going with the next 2 years of his life.
Yeah.
No, 2 years. That's 10 years.
Man,
yeah.
Mike, we have case studies of dorms being built to passive housing. We got several. Well, happy to give them to you.
Okay, cool. So I just need to contact you, and you'll help me put together a proposal. But how about where do I find the developer? Where do I find somebody who knows how to build these things?
I think I think in the case of colleges like that, it's just, you have to show them the case studies, right? Because they have the funding, they're going to fund it. If you're talking about providing more housing outside to supplement the college, that's a different argument.
Mike, a lot of times if it's university dorm, they have an RFP. They know what housing they need. They know what's on their books, what they're planning for. So there's a procurement process where they're going around getting their contractors and their developers. There's also a network called the P3 network, which private to public partnerships where outside investors come in and work with the university. Like we're doing that at USM. We're working with Capstone Development, who is a P3 partner, and they're partnering with the university who can't afford to pay all of the financing on the dorm. So it becomes a joint partnership. And so there's a lot of P3 partners out there, and they have their own conferences and things like that. I would suggest maybe checking out those conferences and making some contacts there. As far as, but universities basically have a long-term plan. They know what they need for dormitories. They know that sort of stuff. If you're talking about off-campus housing, that's a different thing, I think. Then you need to start looking for land.
Right.
And rich uncles.
Yeah.
The thing I would add to that, maybe from the two different angles there, whether it's happening within the university or not, is I know that universities, when we're thinking about high performance buildings, it's often the person who really understands that is actually in the facilities department. It's maybe not actually the number two person. He might not know what the energy loads are and what that actually costs and how that relates to the line item of how much the potential savings could be if you did this. Whereas if you can get that person on your side and then start to make the argument from an economic perspective, there's a pretty good one internally. And I think that relates to my second point, which is I encourage really anybody who's in this field at all, designers, builders, whether you're just energy modelers or anything, to understand a real estate development pro forma will unlock so much about what's possible. And it really isn't that complicated. You can look, there's some that are pretty detailed, but like the economics of it, if you spend a little bit of time studying where's the money coming from, where's it going to, how much are they assuming a cost for energy loads, how much would I be assuming if I could lower that, you can actually see the impact of a lower energy load. Like a lot of us talk about it in percentages of reduction or percentages of additional cost, but we need to actually understand it from the perspective of the pro forma. And what does that 1.5% represent on a project basis? What does it represent compared to other things that have other percentages within a development project? And I think that if we all spend a little more time when we're working on development projects, understanding it from the context of a pro forma, the tool that's used for our developers to understand their economics of their projects, we could all have a bit more educated conversations around all of the things that we care about. So that would be the other thing I'd say is sort of study up on that. So at least be able to have the conversation, whether you want to do the development yourself or not.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you both. What do you think about, or this relates, like I know we talked a lot about Passive House. What do you both think about the living building challenge as a frontier? Is that just a carrot that's keeping us interested if we've already mastered Passive House? Does it have a future? Is it changing the industry? Do you even know what it is?
Yeah. Yes, I know what it is. It's difficult, but it's the only program out there that makes you prove performance. You have to show them utility bills for a year to get your certification, right? And if you're not making it, it forces you to figure out why and fix it. Like it's the only program that makes you do that. So in one way, it's brilliant. The other way, super freaking hard. but no, it's interesting.
Yeah, and what I love about it is it's forcing us to, even if we're not doing a living building challenge project, to think about all of those things related to it and forcing us to get different products, which, even Passive House is already looking at embodied carbon, right? So they're looking at changing their idea of, okay, well, what is it that we're putting in our buildings? Even just those little things that can force our manufacturing of products to look at what's in their product, right? Because I think part of the hardest thing, and we've had a couple of living building challenge case studies on here, is like the red list. Man, it's like 100 hours of just research on what you can use and what you can't use. But if that's going to force our product manufacturers to change because we want something that's different, that's awesome. So then it's going to make Passive House a pretty good house, and all the other ones living building challenge in the end.
Yeah, I've more recently in my career been focusing less on the certifications and more on what I think the impacts would be on the other end. And sort of in the same light that I really do appreciate of the Living Building Challenge, of shedding light on all those things, like you were saying, Emily, of making us think about what those things are. CoEverything, we've created what we call our good development standards. And so it actually looks beyond just the planet, so the energy efficiency or what all the materials are, but it also looks at what are the impacts of who you're hiring, of where the materials are coming and how it impacts who those people are who are on the other end of those supply chains. Things about how we're actually engaging people within the process of doing development work. And so sort of in the same light that Living Building Challenge is sort of opening up the perspective of what do we think about when we make a building. That's where we're at, is let's open that up even one step further and think about how is it actually impacting not just the planet and not just the profit, which here we talk a lot about, but what about the people who are actually involved in making all of these things go, and how do we have the most positive impact on all three of those things simultaneously, which they do have a pedal for something sort of abstractly related to that within the Living Building Challenge, but it doesn't sort of dig into the details of that like the local community and having ways in which we could think about how we're impacting the local community. So that's more of been our sort of spirit around things these days. Even though partners of ours have done Living Building Challenge, so we like understand the challenge of it, just as we've done Passive House and LEED and all of the things. We sort of do them to say, okay, yeah, we get what that is. What did it actually achieve in terms of impact on people, planet, and profit? And how do we actually achieve what that impact was, as opposed to adding probably 1.5%, but in consulting fees, when the total project cost is 1.5%. I could maybe save some of that cost. So I'd say that's also similar to the Pretty Good House spirit too. And we're expanding the not just Pretty Good House, but Pretty Good Development. Maybe we could say that.
Ooh, that's our.
I think he just volunteered to write a book. Did you hear that, Peter? No, I think that and I think in the overall building science community too, right, is they take the things that they've learned from all these certification processes. Like you're right with the Pretty Good House. It's like, what do we learn from this? What is really critical that we do? And I love how you were talking about, community and local community and getting those involved. And there was a Living Building Challenge, I think, college building that we talked about, the Candida building, I think.
Yeah.
And that was really cool that they had to build this floor system, and they got all these local people together to build this floor system. And I felt like they really kind of got the point of what that pedal was. But is it point chasing? Is it pedal chasing? Is it whatever? But like, you just made me think too, is like, okay, well, do we think about the products that we buy and how that affects the communities where our products come from, right? Those people who are producing those things. Like, it's just such a way bigger, way beyond. I mean, talking about embodied carbon and the impact of the material showing up on your site felt like such a new thing. Now we're thinking about like so much more than that. And it's cool and it's fun and it's entertaining. And I think that's one thing about development that is interesting to me, is it really starts to take it like 6 levels out from where you are, if you're conscious and thinking about it. It's not just, I built this house and this is what it's going to cost me to live in it, but so much more beyond that, which is really cool. Developers who are doing better, I should say, like you guys.
So in single family work, one hindrance is getting builder buy-in, and like one thing they always push back against is all these European products we like to use, the membranes and the tapes and the windows and the Zender and the this and that. Is that, do you need to use those types of projects at larger scale? Do we need to use them at small scale? What do you think about those sort of nuts and bolts items?
Now, we try and accommodate most of our builders with local products they can get off the shelf. It's most about techniques to make sure they're installed properly. The one thing that is still sort of lacking here is American-made really good windows that meet the air tightness requirements that that meet the air tightness requirements that we need. Also that meet the frame requirements that we need. Window manufacturers are tooled a certain way to create a certain frame. And to create these really high thermally broken frames, you need to retool your shop. So I think we're on the brink of them seeing enough of the European stuff coming into the market that they're like, okay, maybe it's time. And we're starting to see some turnover, and some of the window manufacturers were a little more high performance to begin with. So that's the one place where we're still pulling stuff in from overseas, but we use air sealing and membrane products and all that you can get in the United States. It does not have to be specialty products from Europe.
We also we lose sight, Mike, that in larger commercial projects like this, they're used to having a spec book, where in the residential world, it's whatever we grab at the local lumber yard that morning. So yeah, this is not a big hurdle as far as I understand it.
That's a really interesting perspective, Ben. What we found is too that the larger scale builders, the architects are used to drawing more details. They have spec books. They have a contractor who already is used to doing a water membrane on the exterior of the building. We're finding our small scale wood builders are having a much harder time meeting those air change requirements and the quality of workmanship that needs to go in than our large scale builders, just because they're used to that level of rigor. And so it's been really an eye-opening experience for us. We're like, oh, it's a small scale project. No, it's having a way harder time. Yeah.
Well, it's like things like fluid applied WRBs, like in the residential world, that's like voodoo or something like that.
Exactly.
I can call up a commercial waterproofing company from New Haven, and they'll be out Tuesday and install whatever product I want, and not even think about it, and do it at a competitive price because they do hundreds of thousands of square feet of it every week.
Exactly.
Well, and I think the thing that we forget about too is the larger the building gets, the different things that start to become bigger ticket items or bigger issues or whatever, right? Like, not that mechanical isn't a thing in residential structures, but like when we were doing a lot of energy consulting or whatever, the mechanical is a way bigger piece because you don't have as much skin on a building as you have mechanical equipment, right? That might serve your buildings. And so, yes, windows are still a problem, but like the building envelope starts to go down in the scale as all the other systems that are part of the building go up in scale, the bigger your building gets, right? And so it's just a little bit different. You can't apply the same residential rules, which is probably why it's just so much more expensive in single family residential as you do in larger buildings.
Well, you've also got common corridors, you've got elevators, you've got structural concrete and steel, like this, the impact of everything, it's just that much more expensive. Yeah. That you don't have on your nice residential, smaller application.
So speaking of that, are you doing any CLT buildings?
No, in New York. The fire department rules that city. It's not the mayor.
Yeah, because not cost effective in single family residential, but super cool in some bigger buildings.
It is. I keep drooling over what they're doing in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about on bigger projects? What do you do about ventilation? Does like each unit have its own ERV or HRV? Is there like a centralized system when you get tall? Does it get hard to have those operate once you get some stack effect going on?
Ventilation is the hardest thing in a large scale multifamily building. The hardest thing. It's not the air barriers, not the windows, it's the ventilation. Single family individual units in every apartment have so many issues, between getting the vapor retarder right on the ductwork to the outside, to making sure people don't turn them off, to the super actually cleaning the filters 2 to 3 times a year. And then you also need to clean the intake on the outside of the building. So the taller you get, the harder that gets, right? So there's so many issues with that. And then central systems are not a perfect storm either. They're not a perfect solution. The stack effect isn't as big a deal as making sure those ducts are so airtight that you could, blow them up like a balloon. They have to be so airtight to make sure you get the air where you need it to go and not out leaks. And then the installers aren't used to that level of quality. Car dampers aren't 100% perfect. We're not finding as much trouble with the stack effect because we do have the pressure regulated dampers and all the registers, but it's our number one headache is getting the ventilation system right.
I nerd out on HVAC and ventilation. And when I was at the FIAS conference, I went to a couple of sessions on multifamily, large-scale ventilation and HVAC. And I walked out with my head spinning with some of the hoops you guys are jumping through to make
one of the guys might have been mine.
Oh my God, I forget the woman's name from Mitsubishi was just talking about the use of heat pipes in order to drop dew points on inlet and outlet temperatures across ERVs and stuff that it's like NASA level technology. So I love it, and I feel for your struggle. Thank you for doing it.
We're going to get it right one of these days.
What do you typically use for heating and cooling? Mini splits, or are there fancier systems when you get into that scale?
Most of our projects have either been, the majority have been VRF, right? So central condensers on the roof that can feed multiple apartments. Or we're starting to see more geothermal, right? With water source heat pumps in the apartments. One of our developers really likes that system. You can get some good rebates still for that, tax incentives and things. And then the things that's coming into the market right now are these cold temperature PTACs, right? The high performance terminal heat pumps. So they work down at cold temperatures. They're just through wall units like PTAC. So there's so many benefits of them. So many, it's unbelievable. The problem is it's still a hole through your wall, right? And so can we seal them off when we do your blower door test? And then when we take the tape off, well, you're still going to pass the passive house criteria. So they're not airtight. And so we've been working with a few manufacturers. So we've been testing them for them and trying to give them recommendations on how to bring the air leakage down to a really manageable level. But we haven't had a passive house project that's actually installed them yet. We have one that's committed to it and they're going forward with it. And they're okay if they don't pass the final blower door, if they don't get their final incentives, they haven't included that in their finance package, right? It would just be gravy. So they're like, the occupants can control heat and cooling whenever they want to, as opposed to VRF. If you only have it in a heat pump mode where you're either turning it over in a heating season versus turning it on the cooling system, then if I need cooling in October, which a lot of our passive house projects do, I don't have cooling. So these offer you that option. There's less refrigerant in the building. They're super cost effective to install compared to a VRF system. So there's just all of these benefits, but we haven't done one in possible order yet. So we'll see.
In that vein, I have a friend who's heavily involved in large-scale HVAC throughout New York City, and they've been working with these same European heat pump manufacturers to get them where they're in the existing form factor of already existing PTAC units. So basically, they can go into all these high-rise buildings and just swap them out one-to-one and drop the energy demand by 3 or 4 times.
It's going to be a game changer. It's going to be a game changer.
And they're close, from what I understand. They've been installing some of them, but they're getting to the point where it's financially viable.
Yeah, I super nerd out on HVAC too, Ben, and I think they're finally hearing us saying we need different systems, right? We need smaller systems that are more localized, that are not like these huge, massive, unable to control, especially in apartment buildings, right? You've ever been in an apartment building, it's like in the same zone, but this side's on the south and this side's on the north, and those people are freezing and those people are boiling with the windows open, right? Now you've got this passive house project where half the windows are open on it because, and so getting to the point where we get mechanical to work for the buildings that we have as we improve our buildings is, I don't know why it's so fascinating to me. I did not go to school for mechanical engineering. I did not but it is just so fascinating.
I don't know if it was one of your projects, Lois, that was discussed at the conference, but they had an issue with one of the developments where they were totally blowing their energy goals for the building. And it's because a lot of the people had moved from other steam heated buildings in New York City, where they're used to the temperature in the wintertime being like 80 degrees in their units because of the steam heat constantly on and no way to control it. So when they moved into these high performance buildings, they set their thermostats at like 78 or 80, and it was blowing the energy budget of the building, and they had to, do some occupant behavior retraining and all of that. I just thought
the thing is, they were supposed to lock the thermostats out before the occupants moved in, and then somebody missed doing that. So they didn't want to do it in the middle of the winter, right? So they waited, and for the next year, they locked them out. But they get so many complaints because people want them at 80. And I'm like, it's a passive house project. Just put a little sweater on, like you'll be fine.
You don't need t-shirt and shorts in January.
I know. Yeah.
Well, I think with that, this has been a phenomenal discussion. Declan, Lois, we appreciate you guys for coming on and all of the hard work that you're putting in to continue to push all of this discussion forward and being developers that are doing good. And with that, I'd like to say good night to everybody, unless we have any closing final thoughts anybody wants to throw in. I think this was an excellent show.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So much. Fun.
That was awesome.